Well, good evening, everyone. And my name is Janine Kitson, and I intend to stand as the independent candidate in the upcoming federal election for the seat of Bradfield that includes the suburbs from Chatswood to Asquith. Welcome to my Bradfield Can Do Better webinar. This time is on integrity reform with our special guest speaker, Professor Charles Samford, a director of the non-partisan Accountability Roundtable that is dedicated to improving standards of accountability, transparency, ethical behaviour, and ensuring a strong democracy for Australia. I'd like to begin and pay my respects to the Darramurrugal, Darug and Guringai people on whose land I meet tonight, and I pay my respects to all traditional owners wherever you may be tonight. I honour their stories, their traditions and culture, and I commit to truth-telling, treaty and a voice to Parliament for a just and inclusive future for our First Nations peoples. Now tonight, what are we going to do? We're going to have this webinar on integrity reform, and I'm going to show two short documentary trailers. The first one is called State of Siege, and this documentary is important because it was made by a filmmaker, Dennis Grosvenor, who is a Bradfield constituent. The second trailer is Big Deal, directed by Craig Rucastle, that I think many of you have maybe seen, but we're just showing you that trailer to set the scene about why that leads into Professor Samford's talk. And then I'll formally introduce Professor Charles Samford. While he's speaking, if you would like to ask him a question, just type your question in the chat box and our wonderful Wayne Richmond will help me select those questions and then invite you to ask the question by unmuting and saying it directly to Professor Samford. And then I'll finish with some concluding words. So that will finish the formal part of this webinar. However, if you wish to stay a little bit longer, you can stay and have the opportunity to watch an uplifting and fun performance by our musicians, Chloe and Jason Roweth, who are with us here tonight. And they're going to perform a medley of songs that inspire us to continue this important journey that we demand integrity for this nation at all levels of government. So let's begin. First, I wanted to say something about State of Siege. I've told you it's by a Bradfield filmmaker, Dennis Grosvenor, and he spent 3 years filming this documentary. It was finally screened in 2011. Why did he make this film? Because he was motivated by the devastation wrought by overdevelopment in his once quiet bushland street, and he felt totally powerless to stop it. And this feeling of powerlessness was joined by many other residents, not only in Bradfield, but across Sydney. And at that time, it's the heights of the corruption within the New South Wales Labor government with real concerns about the inappropriateness of political donations from property developers. There's a very last scene in this film that's very quick, but just look for it. You'll hear the voice of the chair of an unelected planning commissioner who took over the powers of the local government. And she is telling the filmmaker to stop filming. Now, hundreds of Bradfield residents were at that meeting in May 2009. And for 3 hours, they got up and spoke and gave 3-minute speeches against the imposition of high-rise development in the Guringai town centres. The planning panel then took 5 minutes and came back and unanimously ignored everything that had been asked by that community and imposed their rezoning on the area. So let's just watch that trailer, State of Siege. Over to you, Wayne.
Something is rotten in the state of New South Wales.
I know how important our homes are to all of us.
Get out! Get out! Get it right! Get out!
We've heard from some of the big developers say, like, I give the money and I expect the Premier to pick up my phone call and talk to me.
There is nothing illegal about people making donations.
It's a corruption of the whole system.
Once they've made the decision that your area is going to high-rise, they've basically stolen your land from you.
Well, we don't know what's going on, we don't know what's going to happen to us, and we want to know.
I think that this present Labor government is probably the most corrupt government since Askin.
You hit the 1990s and the pressure from developers really starts to hit home. These large donations start coming in.
And the one thing that I've always admired New South Wales for is your level of political corruption.
It's time that councils got their powers back. And people like you got your powers back.
There's a great movement of people who now realise that by their own strength and by their own militancy, they can do something about the environment in which they live. It's not much good winning a 35-hour week if we're going to choke to death in planless and polluted cities.
But I am terrified of the legacy that this state government wants to leave us with.
The only grassroots he cares about are the manicured lawns of Ku-ring-gai.
Who are you? Free speech is dead in this country.
Could I ask for you to cease filming, please? Cease filming, please. 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 Cease filming, please.
That film means a lot to many people in Bradfield because they lived through that really time of anger and outrage. And it was against the New South Wales Labor Party with the imposition of their urban consolidation policy from 1995 to 2011, as well as weakening state planning policies. And these weakening came from aggressive lobbying from the property and development industry. The trailer also shows New South Wales as having really a history of corruption, going back to the Askin Liberal government when Unionist Jack Mundy challenged this demolition at all cost ethic and with his Builders Labourers Federation put on the world's first green ban that now we are so grateful for because it's protected so much of Sydney's heritage and environment. We're now going to watch the documentary directed by Craig Brewcastle, Big Deal Now, because this now is 10 years past our first one, and it shines a light again on the political donations that particularly come in this film on the fossil fuel industry and their enormous donations, which has incredibly subverted our democracy and is really culpable for the inaction and our failure to take action on the climate emergency. So let's watch the trailer, Big Deal.
What a politician might say is, okay, yes, I do spend a lot of time with donors. And yes, I listen to those donors. And yes, they give me the money that I need. But that doesn't influence my decision-making. It doesn't. The right to vote is a privilege that I reckon many Aussies take for granted. But are we being taken for granted ourselves? And if we are, what does this mean for our country and for my kids' future? So it's illegal for me to make a donation on an agreement that there will be some kind of outcome.
I think that might be a bribe.
My name's Christian Van Vuren. Just so we're all clear, way up front, I am no political expert. So many bad decisions are made in this country because of money in politics.
Those lobbyists are like locusts. They are everywhere.
Did you ever make donations to the Labor Party?
Yeah, sure. It's $100,000.
What do you get for $100,000?
they have the political clout to actually get the outcomes they want, even if it's not the best outcomes for the country.
We've got one of the worst political donations laws in the developed world.
Should we be angry about this?
We should be really angry about it.
Election campaigns are expensive.
How are we going to get these laws changed?
Well, do you have $100,000?
No.
If you don't have $100,000, then you've got to organise with other people.
We have the power, not the politicians.
There's something inspiring for my kids to see and for them to understand that they're not powerless.
So that was a big deal, and as I'm sure many of you have seen it, but if you haven't seen it and you'd like to watch the full documentary, it's available on ABC iView. And that makes me say, aren't we privileged to have a national broadcaster who does the heavy lifting and shows us important public interest programs about integrity that we would never see on commercial stations. So this webinar on integrity reform is incredibly relevant at this time. 2/3 of Australians support the creation of a powerful federal anti-corruption watchdog. Many Australians are deeply concerned about pork barrelling by governments to win elections, or where one political candidate just alone spent $83.6 million on misleading political advertising. And of course, we're disappointed that we still do not have a strong Commonwealth Integrity Commission. Now, I hope you've been thinking about some questions and writing them in the chat box, because now it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Charles Samford, who is a director of the Accountability Roundtable, the Foundational Dean of Law and Research at Griffith University, the director of the Institute for Ethics, Governance and Law, and he is a part-time barrister. He will now speak on integrity reform, necessary and possible. Welcome, Professor Charles Samford.
Thank you very much. Wayne, if you'd like to put on the first slide. Good. You know, slight change to the title with the Accountability Roundtable is beginning a bit more stroppy recently, and so the things where we've said reform is absolutely necessary and entirely possible, one of our directors suggested the term integrity now. Next slide, thanks. The Accountability Roundtable has been around for about 20 years. It's a mixed. It's a non-partisan body. It's a mixture of academics, former judges, and civil servants, with a sprinkling of politicians, ex-politicians from a range of different parties. And we work very hard to ensure that non-partisan. That doesn't mean we don't make criticisms of both parties at various times, but that's what we've been in for 20 years. We've been talking about accountability, public trust, integrity and corruption. We've suggested reforms to combat corruption and strengthen accountability, public trust and integrity. And we've tried to swat away misguided, mendacious and self-serving arguments used against those reforms, which is a never-ending responsibility. The particular paper that I'm talking from today started because in March we saw a fairly novel argument from a former debater who was then the Attorney General. There are a number of accusations made against him. We won't discuss what they are. The New South Wales Police started an investigation but found insufficient admissible evidence to charge him. But when other forms of inquiry were suggested, including an investigation of his fitness for office as Attorney General, he denied the allegation and complained that calls for that process would be contrary to the rule of law. In fact, he said that there would be no rule of law left if in fact there was some investigation. The police had decided there wasn't enough evidence to charge, admissible evidence to charge him. Therefore, it'd be outrageous for any other form of inquiry as to his fitness for office to take place. Now, this is slightly bizarre. We're the Accountability Roundtable, and we said, well, what happens to ministerial accountability? I'm afraid the thing is it's not since the 18th century that ministers had to be convicted of a crime before they actually left office. That's actually the process of impeachment, which was done at the time that the King chose ministers rather than the Parliament. But the thing is that you're accountable as a minister. It's not a matter of your minister until you're found guilty in a criminal court. But basically, ministers are accountable to Parliament, which has the right to make any inquiries it sees fit to determine whether it retains the confidence in ministers. And you cease being a minister not because you're convicted of a criminal offence, but merely because somebody prefers somebody else to you. Somebody might be your electors, it might be the Parliament, it might actually be your Prime Minister. But the thing is that it's one of the most precarious and intentionally precarious jobs in the country. And in fact, when we first introduced responsible government into Australia, ministers were described as public officials liable to retire on public ground, on political grounds. And that's the point. He's a minister liable to retire on political grounds as soon as the Parliament doesn't want him. So we thought it was quite strange that you'd find somebody who ought to know a lot about the rule of law. A lot of people senior lawyers made criticisms of it, but we decided that it's important to look at the relationship between these concepts, rule of law, accountability, integrity, and so forth. And we put together a small group, which actually included a few academics with governmental and parliamentary experience, such as myself. We had ex-civil servant, and we actually had three doyens of our politics. Barry Jones, Lynn Allison, former Democrat, and John Hewson. And we've come up with a number of suggestions. It's not a short paper, it's 60 pages, but in fact, every one of the 21 reforms we suggest has to be sort of rushed over quite quickly. And we've got a lot of suggestions of areas where we could have integrity improvements, and we've got a wide range. We've got 21 recommendations as to better governance for our citizens. Now, I don't have to tell you that the situation is grim. You probably wouldn't be here if you didn't think it was grim, although I know the thing is when lockdown finishes, Sydney may well go to anything, but I'm sure the thing is that you're there because you think it's pretty grim. And you no longer have to convince the Australian people that it's pretty grim, as indicated in the recent Australia Talks survey. Reform is absolutely necessary, but we argue that reform is entirely possible. Despite plumbing the rum-soaked depths of our first and only coup d'etat in 1808, Australia has made major contributions to accountability mechanisms. And to the extent that one of the few things that I disagree with Geoffrey Watson is that it was not as bad as the Rum Corps, not least because in the Rum Corps won. That Australia's got a tremendous record on integrity reforms. It started with secret ballots, voting rights, ending gerrymandering, which put a sudden, unexpected and unlamented end when in the 1980s, the Australian politicians just decided, let's get rid of them. And a reform that was predicted by many to be impossible and would never happen, happened overnight, almost overnight, when within a very few years, all the states created electoral commissions to oversee boundary changes. The Commonwealth's new administrative law enacted in the 1970s was probably the greatest set of reforms, most far-reaching governance reform to occur without a prior without a prior scandal, sorry. The Fitzgerald reforms were quite remarkable. I was there to witness them, and we saw when Queensland went from being the butt of every ethics joke there ever was to become a global exemplar. And I mean a global exemplar. The OECD, the World Bank and others, transparency, this is the way to do it. And so Australia can do it. As how I'll reflect briefly later on as to why, how it happened in Queensland and how it might happen here. Firstly, very briefly, and the next slide, please, Wade. Just want to unpack the concepts which are bandied around and made bandied around by those often for self-interest. But we're trying to sort of sort it out. The rule of law has a range of different meanings, largely self-supporting. But the most important element is that public officials must exercise powers conferred on them reasonably in good faith for the purposes for which the powers are entrusted and without exceeding the limits of such powers. Basically, it's our power, it's entrusted to politicians, and the rule of law means that they can only exercise the powers they're given for the purposes for which they're given. Public trust is a related concept. The powers exercised by officials belong to us. It doesn't belong to the politicians. They are entrusted with those powers by us, and they have to be exercised for us. Accountability. Officials are accountable to the extent they're required to demonstrate that they've used their entrusted powers in officially approved ways and for purposes for which they're empowered. I mean, the whole idea of accountability is that you've got this power, you've got to account for how you used it and make it and ensure that you've only used it, that what powers you have for the purpose you're given. Corruption. Again, all of these are related. Corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for personal or party political benefit. This is a very widely used definition of corruption. And I've always seen integrity as the opposite side of that coin. Integrity is the use of entrusted power for publicly justified and officially endorsed ends. Thus, in a sense, all of these key governance concepts, they're not in conflict. They're not an excuse, an opt-out for accountability, as Christian Porter tried to use them. They're all about how politicians use our power and the purposes for which they're used. And this, if you can see, you'll see is a common theme throughout all the recommendations. Next slide, please. So what to do? A strong federal ICAC is mentioned, and it's necessary but not sufficient. We've argued you need an integrated suite of reforms. This is actually what they did in Queensland and what became the global exemplar. You need supportive integrity agencies and integrity measures that make up what we call an integrity system. Although the thing is that a lot of the reforms are around new integrity agencies, anti-corruption commissions, FOI commissioners and so forth, we emphasise that Parliament must be at the heart of the integrity system, must be at the centre of it. And that, as I say, Parliament has to be at the heart of the integrity system, and the other integrity agencies will help Parliament do its job, make sure Parliament is doing its job, make sure that they're doing their jobs. But it's very important that it's not just a matter of having us governed by integrity agencies in place of Parliament. We need both of them together in a way that if one slips up, the other will pick it out. Next slide, please. Wait. So we've come up with recommended set of 21 integrity reforms. Now I'm going to only obviously run through them. I can obviously expand on any of them, and you'll be able to read the full document at your leisure. But the first thing is we've got seven recommendations to make government more accountable to Parliament. We want to see, we emphasise the oversight of delegated legislation. I'm not sure if all of those here would know about it, but that quite often the legislation passed through Parliament will provide for that the detail can be filled out, sometimes by the courts by interpretation, but very often by regulations passed by the government. But the thing is that because if they'd been in the legislation in the first place, both houses would have had to agree to it, which actually means that if either House of Parliament objects to the regulation, then that is void. It is not. It doesn't pass. And it's this fundamental thing to ensure that the control of legislation is in the hands of the Parliament and not in the hands of the executive. And unfortunately, there's been a lot of backsliding in this. Oversight of treaties. The Parliamentary Committee has a joint committee on treaties which can make recommendations, but the government is not bound by it. We actually argue that this should be a more that it should if the Senate accepts the treaty, it should then be legislated, and if it's not legislated, if it's not isn't passed by the Senate, it shouldn't be allowed to be signed. Spending, far too many sort of broad-based spending rights are given to various ministers and the Treasurer in particular. So including the most recent thing, over $2 billion of decisions made but not yet announced. This sort of thing needs to stop. The whole reason why democracy is because parliaments sought to control the expenditure of the government and thereby took it over. And that's why we're a democracy under the Westminster system. Unfortunately, it's going the other way. Going to war, the most important decision that anybody can make. You may not realise that although the decision to go to war is always a political one taken by cabinet, the person who signs off is actually the Minister for Defence. It's not the Governor General. It's not even the Prime Minister. The Minister of Defence writes a memo and we're at war. However much you may respect and value the integrity, the perspicacity, the forward-thinking nature of our current Minister of Defence, even if there was a saint in that position, I still wouldn't want that person to sign off on a war. I want to get parliamentary approval, and also that the Parliament be allowed to set up a committee which gets all the confidential information, and they will then make a recommendation as to whether Parliament agrees to go to war or not. This is not an irrelevant issue now. It never has been, and it's likely to be even more relevant in the next 20 years. Other areas we want to sort of make government more accountable: improving question time, ensuring better community resources, and accountability of ministerial staff to committees in a way that is currently denied. Next, set of integrity institutions to help make Parliament more accountable. Certainly having a Commonwealth Integrity Commission, Anti-Corruption Commission, but we need other institutions. The ANAO, the Audit Office, of course, is there. We have an Ombudsman, we have an FOI Commissioner. We need a lot of those things to be strengthened. We need a Judicial Commission to recommend appointments to the judiciary, rather than allowing the possibility of bench stacking. Bench stacking has been occurring outrageously at the lower levels of the Federal Court and the AAT. So far, we haven't seen it at the federal level, but would you trust our politicians of either side to be able to stack the court if they had the opportunity? We need a greater level of judicial review. We need to go beyond freedom of information to what some people call the right to know. And what I would argue is that simple proposition is that information collected by the government using our resources and the powers that we entrust them, that information belongs to us. And you need a good reason not to give what belongs to us to us. There are some reasons, but the reasons that are given so often is cabinet confidentiality, commercial in confidence, and professional secrecy, professional confidentiality are grossly overused and need to stop. Basically, it's our information. Government should be able to persuade an independent body that information should be withheld for us. And they're obviously private information about individuals. That's a classic case where one would think it's justified. Most of the rest are not. And so those are the kinds of things. Judicial review has been, which is actually, for those who aren't used to it, aren't lawyers, is the power of judges to say that a minister has misunderstood his power or has taken into account irrelevant considerations or improper purposes, and can actually nullify a decision, an executive decision by a minister or a civil servant, because it's legally defective, and again because they haven't taken into account relevant considerations. which comes back to our basic concept that powers are entrusted for specific purposes. We also want to increase accountability for, the other thing, we also want guaranteed funding. We don't want the ANO having its budget cut just because it's doing a good job. Beyond that, we want to increase the accountability of politicians. Really important is enforcing the Ministerial Code, legislating for that code, and ensuring independent advice and investigation. At the moment, we've actually got quite a good Ministerial Code. It requires that ministers must neither lie nor mislead the public. But the problem is that who is it who decides whether a minister has lied or misled the public and what consequence there be? It's the Prime Minister. Now, we've pointed out that the Prime Minister is, however virtuous he or she might be, is hopelessly and irredeemably conflicted. The Prime Minister has appointed these people. It'll be embarrassing for him if they have to resign, especially if the minister happens to be himself. So it's just totally contrary to the rule of law that the Prime Minister should be making these decisions, and handing it off to a public servant whom you could sack without reason at any time is not an alternative. We have argued very strongly to have an ethics advisor on the lines of the Integrity Commissioner in Queensland, who can give advice to any Parliament, any MP and senior public servants on pretty well any ethical issue, especially conflicts issues. And then you have an Integrity Commissioner who will investigate breaches. And this brings together the best of the Canadian, the Australian and the British systems, all of which have gone beyond this nonsense of having the Prime Minister a judge in his or own cause or in the cause of one of his or her ministers. We also need to look at addressing truth in politics. We've got a number of specific suggestions we can go into dealing with money in politics and media reform, because media is one of the most important accountability mechanisms in our polity. The French used to call it the fourth estate. But they didn't think it was an estate run from Delaware, residing in New York. And so the thing is that that's only one part of it. But we believe that the Americans have got a lot of good ideas, including the idea that media owners shouldn't be foreign, which is the reason why Rupert Murdoch changed his citizenship. I mean, we thought that was fine. He could change his citizenship, which means he give up his electronic media here. But the thing is, as I say, there are a lot of things we need to do in addressing, improving the media. I would argue very strongly that the professionalisation of the media is a critical and necessary reform. We go into it elsewhere. Other things is preventing the abuse of power to get re-elected. I said, of course, that politicians are only supposed to use their power for the purpose for which they're given. One of the purposes we don't give money to politicians in order to get themselves re-elected. That's our choice, not their choice. And so that the use of our money in pork barrelling is utterly outrageous. Also, the thing is that we haven't seen much of it. There are attempts to introduce voter suppression, and there is, of course, the perennial advantage that the party in power gets to choose when the election is, and gets to choose the time when it most suits it. So these are the sort of things that we should prevent government abuse of power in order to get elected. That's next slide, thanks. So those are actually 20 of the reforms. And making it happen is another thing, is that our 21st recommendation is one of the key to the success of the Fitzgerald reforms. Fitzgerald had a lot of ideas, a brilliant man, I know him very well, and he had a vision of what needed to be done, but he didn't think he had all the answers. He said, yes, we need an independent commission against corruption, which is called the CJC now, the CCCC. But he also suggested a governance, what I call generically a governance reform commission, the Electoral and Ministerial Reform Commission, which looked at every element of governance in Queensland, from the Constitution down to FI legislate 22 or 28 areas that needed to be examined. And this independent body, it wasn't a law reform commission, there were lawyers on it, but they were interdisciplinary lawyers and there are economists and political scientists on it. And they had the responsibility to look at every aspect of governance in Queensland and to make reports on what they recommended, which went to a parliamentary committee and went to the Parliament. So the Parliament had to legislate. But it was like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Once it started, these reports kept on coming. And it was very hard for governments to say, oh, we don't want to do that. So in the end, they actually got rid of the Governance Reform Commission, the EARC. But this, I think, is, I've often called it the lesson not learned. It's a process for reform. And in these cases, I think that a lot of reforms suggested should be legislated by the first government that's willing to do so. But there should be a long-running responsibility of a Governance Reform Commission, which will look at existing reforms, look at challenge, look at problems. The corrupt are actually innovative. Look at what the innovatively corrupt are doing, adjust the integrity system and so forth. And I think that was the core to the governance reforms of Queensland. They're also open to other reforms later on, which I could name a number of them. And when one government tried to, two governments twice tried to nobble our Anti-Corruption Commission, they were the ones who lost office because, in fact, there was much more faith in the anti-corruption commissions than there were in the corrupt politicians. How did we get to that? And I think this is a question. So here's 21 reforms, and all the pessimists will say that'll never happen. Look, having one is more than we can expect. As I say, there was a process like this which was very successful. And how did we get to it? Corruption was exposed so fundamentally, completely by the Fitzgerald report that politicians felt it absolutely necessary for their political survival to engage in root and branch integrity reforms. And I've never forgotten when Fitzgerald, before he delivered his report, both parties were trying to outdo themselves in saying that they were going to legislate 100% of his recommended reforms, or lock, stock and barrel. They were trying to think, there is this arithmetic problem that you can't get a percentage higher than 100%, but they were trying to imply that they were going to be even better than the other one. And so it got to the point where the perception of corruption was so great that politicians not acting on it saw retirement on political grounds in their faces. How do we do it now? I think we can. I hope we can, because the thing is, the Australian people are really pissed off. Now, I hope it's going to be one of the major parties will actually adopt a set of reforms like this, and that independents will adopt, as far as possible, hopefully all 21 recommendations. If it's only 19 or 20, we'll talk to us about it, and I suppose that's fair enough. But that if hopefully at least one party will go for it. In 1989, both parties were going for it. Maybe that's asking too much, but the more the merrier. And actually, the thing is, in Queensland, I've got to say, some of the Queensland Nationals were so cross about the level of corruption that had been exposed. They thought there was a bit of it, but had no idea how to. Basically said, do it, reform it. We might be out of office for 20 years, but we've done the right thing. Now, I'm not holding my breath for that to happen. It might if we continue to expose it. But the second thing, of course, is the independence of the minor parties. If they say we are going to insist on it, and if they've got a majority in the lower house, they can bully whichever party is prepared to go along with these reforms. It's a different mechanism for Queensland. It depends on political will, which is based upon an absolute determination of the public that they will not put up with it anymore. I'm delighted to take questions. The last slide will show that the position paper will go on the Accountability Roundtable website early next week with a comment section. Janine has a copy, and I hope she'll be happy to share it with you, or you can contact me. I'm delighted to have any input. I don't believe that this is the fount of all wisdom, but it's the attempt that the Accountability Roundtable has made to list the reforms that we need for our democracy. Questions?
So, well, while we're thinking about a question, let's give Professor Sanford a little clap, because what he has done is really give us a very comprehensive analysis of solution-based reform, and that is very exciting, very thorough, and that all that information will be available shortly. So, Wayne, do we have any questions that you'd like to invite people to ask? Well, I might have one question just to get going. Professor Sanford, you know, in a way I'm asking a bit of a repeat of really what you've already said, but is winning elections without integrity the main political game today?
Clearly, I think politicians want to win elections. I'm not sure that they necessarily want to win without integrity. I mean, they're not as principled as that. They're prepared to win without integrity. They're also prepared to win with integrity. They couldn't see how it could be done. But so actually, they don't insist on integrity. I think the key thing is that, in one sense, that politicians are seeking power sometimes in order to use the power for the purpose which is given, and sometimes their own purposes. I think the key thing is that we want to make it, recognise the temptations and opportunities for abusing power and try to close them off, so that the irrational politician will recognise that it's too risky to seek to win an election through a lack of integrity, and therefore a rational politician will actually will actually act with integrity. And the only ones we have to deal with are the irrational ones who don't realise that it's in their interests. But the irrational politicians are, until recently at least, have been the easier target. So yes, the thing is, I think that that there is a tendency, and to some extent, the thing is that politicians are those who seek power, and I think we recognises that they're seeking power for a range of different reasons, and we want to sort of channel their behaviour through a mixture of ethical standard setting, legal regulation, various incentives, and various institutional structures to make it unlikely that a rational politician would seek to act corruptly. They might try to the edges and try to slap them on the fingers when they step over.
Elizabeth Dax, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. Thank you, Charles.
Oh, hi, Liz.
Hello, I'm a co-director of the Accountability Roundtable and glad to be here. My question, Charles, is with the judicial review, there's a lot of judges right now, or people in the law, really objecting to the lack of integrity in government. And there are also bodies, groups of judges that are really working. So how does judicial review work, and why do we not hear more about it?
If you're a lawyer, you know a lot about it. I mean, it's one of those. I mean, it's interesting that we have this Westminster system, which we have a number of elements of it. Some of it are well known, some of them are not well known. Judicial review actually started off when most of the legal and executive work was actually done by local magistrates or local justices of the peace. Separation of powers, forget about that. But the King actually had a series of judges who were supposed to sort of make sure that the JPs and the magistrates operating in the counties were doing the right thing as far as the King was concerned. So that this gave a role, and then it's a very complicated history where this became formalised, and there were writs of various things. One of them, writ of mandamus, which said that which is a requirement that an official act in a particular way, and that because basically it found that he'd exceeded his powers or used his powers in the wrong way, therefore his action was void, and therefore ordering him to do it right. And there are other writs which developed over time and became a really important element of ensuring that the executive only acted lawfully. There are limits to judicial review. It's not what's called a merits review. It's not the judge doesn't put themselves in the place of the decision maker. That's what we have the Administrative Appeals Tribunal for. But the judges are making, as a matter of law, did the official have the power, and had they taken into account irrelevant considerations of proper purposes, or were they acting under direction? A whole series of ways in which was actually a misuse of power by officials. And this has become more sophisticated. They simplified it in the 1970s, and they even went as far as that this applied to anybody, even the Governor General, even Cabinet, even the Prime Minister could be subject to judicial review. And the court would say, I'm sorry, but you did it wrong. As far as we're concerned, you haven't done it. And sometimes they'd say, you've got to do it this way, and some say, do it again. So that's an important part. And it reached its high point in the early 1980s, but it's been gradually restricted. And in some matters, only the High Court can exercise extrajudicial review over some decisions. And the reason why is, of course, constitutionally, they can't be taken away. And I think that there are a lot of lawyers and those who are familiar with it would very much like this to come back. It's not the sole element. Things like an ombudsman, for instance, and freedom of information commissioners and anti-corruption commissioners have other roles, but in a sense, they're mutually supportive. They attack different elements of wrongdoing or failure to do the right thing.
Klaus, would you like to ask your question?
I just unmute myself. All right.
Yes.
You can hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
Well, I asked the question. These reforms that you suggest are really excellent, but it seems to me that it would be best if they were written into the Constitution in some way. And of course, to say that that we can write things like this into a Constitution is, of course, almost impossible in Australia because it can hardly be amended. So it seems to me that the ultimate answer here is that we get a new Constitution, that we say, well, 1901, we were we had 6 colonies and formed it into one, but not much else was done. And the problem is that this Constitution has never been really updated. So it seems to me that updating should be a history. Forget about updating because it just doesn't work. We'll be busy for another 100 years. So it seems to me that your ideas should form partly the essence of a new Constitution for Australia.
People are in the chat.
Very interesting. 2 things about that. Firstly, as far as difficulty to change the Constitution, very first article I ever wrote, 1979, was on changing the Constitution. I pointed out that every single referendum that has been put at an election time with bipartisan support has succeeded. And it's actually appropriate that there should be bipartisan support before there's changes to the Constitution. And in fact, where they've just done that and decided to wait until the next election, it's always gotten through. And very few people realise this interesting fact. It to some extent it can be seen as wondering why Australians are more prepared to change the Constitution when they're distracted by an election. May not reflect all that well on us. So that's the thing about changing the Constitution. But with what you suggest, in fact, there are a lot of, if you look at constitutions around the world, especially in the former British Commonwealth, you see that there's sort of almost development. It's as if that when a new constitution is created in one particular state, in that case, it looks at almost the lessons with other constitutions have been included. And Kenya, for instance, is one where they've actually tried to sort of put constitutional bodies for all of the kinds of things we've talked, or virtually all the kinds of things we've talked about, written by a brilliant constitutional lawyer, marvelous guy. But the thing is that there is actually a question as to whether you want to put these in the Constitution or not. And this is something that we have tended to have a constitution, the British particularly, but also ourselves, tend to have a constitution that evolves over time by conventions. And that if you do have a constitution, especially, you don't want a constitution to change too rapidly. It's not the point of it. But if you write in the constitution, in that case, you may miss the benefits of subsequent good ideas. And like what the Governance Reform Commission says, let's change that a little bit. Let's merge those. Let's actually build the links between those two agencies. Various things like this. You've written all the Constitution, and you've got to change the Constitution again for it. So there is actually a respectable argument to say that some of these things probably are fine if they're statutory bodies, especially if you have bipartisan requirements for various elements to it. And I think that also some of these, so I think that we suggest, for instance, that there be bipartisan process for appointment of commissioners to all integrity agencies, that there be guaranteed funding, and that this be done by Parliament, not by not put forward in the budget by the executive, and so that so as to strengthen these institutions rather than to entrench them constitutionally. But I think that's it's always an open debate, and there are some things you want entrenched, like the judiciary, absolutely, and there are some other what people call fourth arm of government institutions like FOI and commissioners and so forth, ombudsman. I think there's a balance, but bear in mind that if you put it all in the Constitution once, it'll be hard to pick up the next benefit. And that's a question of how optimistic you are about how the process is going to work. If you think it's all going to come at the first opportunity, it's going to be destroyed by the politicians, then you put it in the Constitution. But if in fact you have a process of gradual reform based upon the Governance Reform Commission, maybe it's better not to freeze it in aspect. I'm always conscious that the American Constitution had some good ideas, but largely its structure, it froze the Constitution of George III in England. And they didn't much like George III, I believe. So to the extent that the next time they had a president called George was more than 200 years after the first one. Having said that, and all jokes aside, I think that if you look at the American Constitution as trying to write it down in something that's hard to change, then sometimes they get some things wrong, like impeachment of ministerial responsibility. It's very hard to change it.
I think we probably need to finish up now, yeah. Janine.
Okay, well, thank you, Professor Sanford. Now, you can see how complicated integrity is, and he really has given us a terrific overview. In fact, I'm going to have to re-look at this video and play it again because there is so much there, and we can do that because it's being recorded. Thank you, Professor Sanford, because I think what's really important is that you really have given us an opportunity to recognize that integrity reform is possible, and you have put together a platform which really hopefully will get onto the political agenda and build that bipartisan report, because as you say, the public is really ready for it. We're tired of the scandal. We're tired of the secrecy. We're tired of, you know, our democracy under threat. And when we've seen it happen in so recently, last January in America, it is really terrifying. So thank you so much. And we have a lot of homework to do. I also, yeah, let's give Professor a little clap. And I also thank my wonderful Wayne Richmond, who has provided expert technical support in hosting the Zoom event and helping with the Q&A. But importantly, I have to thank everyone, each one of you, for coming tonight to my Bradfield Can Do Better webinar. And I really do appreciate that, because this is what I'm trying to do. Integrity is one of my key election platforms, which I'll be running up to the federal election. And there is more information on my website, bradfieldcandobetter.org, and this will be shown there as well. So I finished with one last question. Now, if the Bradfield community really honoured me and elected me as their member, what would I do about integrity? And I guess Professor Sanford has put forward a 21-point plan that I've got to go away and really study and really become highly skilled in, and to really push that agenda. And there are independents in the Australian Parliament, Helen Haynes, who put forward a integrity bill, Zali Stegel about truth in political advertising. So having an independent can make a difference. And that really is the challenge that the nation has to decide when that election is called. So I'm going to now finish the formal proceedings and formally finish our webinar, which is almost just a few minutes before 7, and you can leave. But if you would like to stay a little bit longer before you press that leave button, please stay and enjoy a musical performance by Chloe and Jason Rowett, because they're going to sing us as a medley of songs about integrity. And we must always feel hopeful, because good people make a difference. Good people with integrity make a difference.
These songs,
and I now
been fighting the
say
battle.
thank you and good evening. And I welcome Chloe and Jason Rowett. Would you like to introduce your song that you sang at the 2016 National Folk Festival?
Yeah, thank you, Janine. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to the Professor Sanford there for a very provoking and ultimately promising talk. I think the lecture was really well received here. We're smiling a lot, nodding in agreement and learning a lot. Yeah, John Dengate wrote these parodies. John was a master of many kinds of songwriting, but his political parodies were particularly barbed and sharp. And he knew when to pick the right tune. He considered it a good tune, far too important for just one set of words. So in this medley here, on the word satirical edge, he's written parodies. So along to Tipperary becomes a long way to Cunnamulla. Pack up your troubles becomes pack up your pumpkins. And farewell and adieu to you Brisbane ladies becomes farewell and adieu to your Premier of Queensland. Here's John Dengate's songs for you. I'm sure you know these two. It's a long way to Cunnamulla, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Cunnamulla on the River Warrego. I know there's been a gerrymander, and I know it isn't fair, but I have to rely on Cunnamulla, they vote for me there. Oh, Mr. Bjarke Peterson, he's a genius, it's true. Oh, Mr. Bjarke Peterson, he makes 5 votes equal 2. He divides up the whole electorate, subtracts Aunt Edna's twin. Then he multiplies a rural fraction. Oh, that's how he wins. It's a long way to Cunnamulla, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Cunnamulla on the River Warrego. I know there's been a gerrymander, and I know it isn't fair, but I have to rely on Cunnamulla, they vote for me there.
Here is your ticket to the Senate flow, that's guile, guile, guile. Pack up your pumpkins and your portmanteau and goose step round the pile. Tell the mob in Canberra I walked you down the aisle. So here is your nepotistic ticket flow, sing
Heil, heil, heil. It's a long way to Cunnamulla, it's a long way to go. Roman, so the history textbooks say. He put his horse into the Senate, where he always voted nay. But a horse is still considered useful on the river Warrego. So the ancient Romans got an old grey mare and Queensland got flow. It's a long way to Cunnamulla, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Cunnamulla on the river Warrego. I know there's been a gerrymander and I know it isn't fair, but I have to rely on Cunnamulla. They vote for me there. Farewell and adieu to the Premier of Queensland. Farewell and adieu and goodbye to Sir Joe. You useless old bastard, too long you have lasted. Now your mates have decided that you have to go. You ranted and roared at the Reds and the Greenies. You ranted and roared at the Black and the White. You postured and strutted just like Mussolini. Now your mates have betrayed you, and that serves you right. You pineapple vandal, they've snuffed out your candle. Get back to your peanuts, you senile old soul. Take Flo and your pumpkins, your great pair of bumpkins, and you can start playing lawn bowls and stop playing God. Ranted and roared at the Reds and the Greens. You ranted and roared at the Black and the White. You postured and strutted just like Mussolini. Now your mates have betrayed you, and that serves you right. Oh, you Lutheran pastor, come poor disaster. You darling downs despot, you king-a-roy clown. Get back to your tractor, you seventh-rate actor. You pious, hypocritical adjective now. You ranted and roared at the Reds and the Greenies. You ranted and roared at the Black and the White. You postured and strutted just like Mussolini. Now your mates have betrayed you, and that serves you right. Stick that up your jumper, you old Bible thumper. You second-hand Hitler, you goose-stepping goose. The poisonous old cane toads in gone down the drain mode, like a dribble of Bundaberg sugarcane juice. You ranted and roared at the Reds and the Greenies. You ranted and roared at the Black and the White. You postured and strutted just like Mussolini. Now your mates have betrayed you, and that serves you right. I think Martin Pearson said to me once that once John had you by the throat, he didn't let go.
Authorised by Janine Kitson, Suite 1A, Level 2, 802 Pacific Highway, New South Wales, Gordon 2072.